This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland.
Colin Blight, the fair Colin, he was the one who went to Europe.
He left on a very intrepid journey.
Colin Blight is only one of the many Irishmen who went abroad to the continent of Europe.
Fairly rugged, hefty individual.
He started as a man with this dream and fulfilled it.
Colin Blight was a go-getter.
He was such a strong person, strong-willed, strong personality. He would go on and on and on.
He showed utmost leadership.
People flocked to him. He was very charismatic. He kind of drew people towards him.
He was incredibly successful.
He is a man that is marked by success.
The key to success was never giving in, having that true faith that brought him through it.
He's always seeing something new to do and somewhere new to go.
He was a father of Western Europe.
I'm Paul Wright and welcome to the 12th and last programme of Back from the Brink, the series which investigates the role of the early medieval Irish in helping to save Western civilization. In our last programme we heard how the Irish monk Colin Blight of Bangor left his native Ireland in and around the year 590 AD to establish monasteries in France. After 20 years there, he and his Irish brethren were kicked out of France and forced to find a new home. Eventually Colin Blight travelled through Europe, crossed the Alps and found a monastery in Bobbio, in northern Italy, before dying in the year 615 AD. So what was Colin Blight's ultimate legacy? Glasgow-based early medieval historian David Traynor.
After the barbarian invasions, there was devastation throughout the whole of Europe, and he brought the culture and the learning and the education that just didn't exist before he came. I mean, for example, one of the monastery he built down in Lake Constance, it had been ransacked by Attila the Hun, burnt to the ground, and he actually built a monastery on that, and that's symbolic of what he did for the whole of Europe. He took a place that had been ransacked, was devastated, was lying there in ruin. There were no education, there were no real schools, there was no seats of learning. Colin Blight and his monks brought that to Europe.
Well, really, when Colin Blight and Gaul and the other 10 left Bangor, they were going into France for a start off, which had bishops, but the bishops were not really religious people in those days.
Bangor local historian Marsden Fitzsimons.
And this was the true religion, the Celtic religion, very much so. And it spread then because the Vandals had sacked Rome. And then the Dark Ages had started, and Colin Blight was bringing light from the West, from Ireland to Europe, and lighting up Christianity again. So Europe owes all this, the reawakening, the renaissance of Christianity, thanks to Colin Blight. A wonderful, wonderful legacy he has left behind.
But above all, it was the learning. The monasteries became the universities of Europe, and they were the seats of learning. So that he planted the seed of education and cultural growth that took place and eventually came to flourish in the later 12th and 13th centuries.
Historian David Traynor. Here's Lindisfarne-based early medieval historian Kate Tristram to share her views.
The greatest achievement, though, really must have been this Christian ideal of wholehearted obedience to God as the model for Christian living. I think he planted that in people, planted it in his own disciples, and no doubt he planted it also in the minds of others.
He actually always spoke about Europe as an entity in itself. His famous quotation is, he says, all of us in the whole of Europe were all members of the one body, we're all Franks, Britons, Irish, or whatever race, we're all the members of the one body. You know, it's a beautiful quotation. And there's many folk who would say, and I would agree with them, that Columbanus really should be the patron saint of Europe.
Columbanus, well, sometimes known as the first European. What do we mean by that? Someone who saw right across all the borders. Obviously there weren't the political borders that there are now, but the borders of race in Europe, and through the extraordinary lengths of the journeys that were made by sea, by river and over land, moved the cultural features, reading, writing, from a land that had preserved them, Ireland, back to countries that had been overrun.
Bangor local historian Ian Wilson. Here's David Traynor once again.
The thing that strikes me most about Columbanus was his single-mindedness, his sense of purpose, his sense of vision, his idea that he had an end in view, that he was carrying his cross, he knew where he was going, and he went there. He had nothing put on his plate. He had to fight every bit of the way. He had one of the worst queen mothers that Europe's ever known in Brunhilde. He had the whole army against him. He had all the bishops against him in Gaul. He was chased out the country and he refused to go, and he sneaked away back round the north and away back. Even when he got down to Switzerland, he got this phenomenal opposition from the local tribes, and then from the local government, which shifted hands after the battle, and he had to move across the Alps and down into Lombardy. And all the time he didn't know where he was going. He didn't have the permission of the local king until he got into Lombardy and so on. So it was all this unknown, but he still had his goal, he had his single-mindedness, he had his faith, and it's his faith and his single-mindedness is what he gave to Europe.
We're told that he started many monasteries along the way.
Bangor historian Tom Bowl.
He had a limited period of time, but when we think of what he did in that very short period of time, it is nothing short of a miracle in itself. That is the miracle of the man.
They say brave Columbanus from Bangor came one day, followed by 12 holy men. They sailed to Gaul to pray, renowned for truth and scholarship. The monasteries were built in An and Sweet Fontaine to wipe away all guilt. He was the moral force for truth, with words of Latin and Greek, to pilgrims with discipline and understanding seek. The only way to heaven, care for the sick and poor. Along that road he bravely stood to obey God's loving law. The bishops thought he was a foe, a thorn within their side, but Columbanus stood his ground, hypocrisy defied. Pope Boniface took counsel, paid heed to what he said. The ship of church was guided, and a tide of truth was led. Then came the day of banishment, with monks of Burgundy, sailing up the River Rhine and right through Germany, across the high Swiss mountains to Babio he came, to build an Irish monastery with God's love to proclaim. I sing of Columbanus, setting Europe free from the shackles of dark ignorance and dumb illiteracy.
And although Columbanus of Bangor died in the year 615 AD, nevertheless over the next few centuries thousands of Irish monks left their native Emerald Isle and cheerfully fanned out through Europe, bringing faith and learning with them. Their missionary work helped to reconnect Western Europe with her Christian roots and also her literary and scholarly heritage. And so it was in this way that Ireland played a central role in helping to resurrect Western civilization from the so-called Dark Ages, after the tumultuous fall of the Roman Empire. Historian Tom Bowles.
We shouldn't underestimate the influence that not only Columbanus but many other monks who went from Ireland and travelled into Europe, and we can't underestimate the influence they had, because here they were carrying not a new gospel, not a new education. It was already there, but here from the very outskirts in the west of Europe, there were these people sliding into Europe and re-educating Europe, as well as Christianizing them.
I have a friend in Germany who is quite convinced that a very large number of Irish monks originally evangelized Germany.
Celtic Church historian Ray Simpson of Holy Island, Lindisfarne.
When I first came to study Celtic Christianity, I began to take it really seriously some 20 years ago. I tried to find where the source documents are, and I found out that a whole lot of them are in the libraries of monasteries in Europe, or of museums now sometimes. Why? Because the Irish wandering pilgrims and monks took them there, or wrote them there. And there's no doubt that when what people call the Dark Ages, or used to call the Dark Ages, when in the sense that barbarians occupied areas previously run by the Roman civil service, Irish people had the guts, the imagination, the madness to wander and go in there. And it is very difficult to say what would have happened if they hadn't, but there's no doubt that something very important was inserted into the bloodstream of Europe. I've read various serious works of history, one called The Conversion of Europe, and historians maintain that the conversion of Europe, or the reconversion of Europe in the first millennium, owed more to the Irish pilgrims for the love of God than to official missions.
Doing what Rome never could do, Ireland was able to do through its monasteries and its monks and its learning, to get these sort of restless tribes to settle down.
Early medieval historian Benjamin Cook. And here's David Traynor to share his views.
Because you've got people like it was an Irish monk that set up the town of Salzburg in Austria. There were also famous monks in monasteries all over France in the later Middle Ages who were very influential in the whole thrust of Christianity down through the ages.
There was St. Kilian, and actually Kilian went even further east, as far as Poland.
Historian Marsden Fitzsimons.
So it's not just Western Europe, Is it any wonder in 1954, Robert Schuman, the foreign minister of France, when they unveiled the statue in Luxeuil, he said that Columbanus should be the patron saint of Europe.
Columbanus and his like, who not only preserved Christianity but had a care for classical writings, had a care for art and literature, had a care for science, had a care for law, all those essentials of a civilized society, and they took care that that too was part of their remit. They weren't so narrow-minded not to see society as a whole needing good governance, needing the best of all traditions and influences. And so they preserve so much of that, and particularly the literature. And both in St. Gallen and in Bobbio and later Milan, we have got an enormous corpus of Irish literature that really is an outstanding contribution to the life of Europe.
Bangor local historian Ronnie Nesbitt. Here's Michael King of the Down County Museum to share his views.
The Irish really devoured books. They bought books from all over Europe, particularly northern Spain and France. They brought them into Irish monasteries. They copied them. And of course then they took them with them, particularly gospel books that they could carry and other important books to help them in their missionary work back in Europe, where they were helping to convert barbarian peoples.
I think probably the main thing they would have taken into Europe was scholarship across the board.
Historian Tom Bole once again.
Europe had become rather drab, lacking in any direction, and all of a sudden here were these people bringing order and discipline, and that was certainly lacking in Europe at the time. And discipline was a very major part of the monk's lifestyle.
There is an island in the ocean, there is an island far away, where saints and scholars, monks and brothers knelt in solitude to pray. They travelled far from their dear homeland to spread the teachings far and wide, building monasteries and churches to be an ever-loving guide. Saint Columba, Columbanus, Patrick and the other men bravely ploughed a lonely furrow to plant the seeds of faith back then. When Western Europe was in darkness, the Roman Empire all but gone, they wandered roads of unknown danger, bravely singing God's holy song. They climbed the mountains, crossed the oceans, armed with books instead of swords, preaching peace and God's forgiveness, not hate, but loving words. It was a golden hour for Ireland. These men of love and peace became the pilgrim star for all to follow, casting sunshine on the rain. They paved the road with deep forgiveness, the road that journeys without end, to clasp the hand of God's sweet passion, where strangers turn, becoming friends. It was a golden hour for Ireland. These men of love and peace became the pilgrim star for all to follow, casting sunshine on the rain. They paved the road of deep forgiveness, a road that journeys without end, to clasp the hand of God's sweet passion, where strangers turn, becoming friends.
And staying with the heroic role played by the early medieval Irish in helping to save Western civilization, historian Jan Such Pickard had this to say.
In those early medieval times, people must have lived often very isolated lives. They lived within small communities surrounded by forest or marshes or sea, and very often people would never move outside that place where they grew up for the whole of their lives. They had narrow horizons. The Irish monks lived on a different scale. Their horizons opened up, the sea horizon, which brought them up the west coast of Scotland, or the changing horizons as they walked across the great distances of continental Europe. That they lived with different horizons. They had a vision, and they followed that vision. And this must have had a transforming effect on the communities with which they came in contact.
We must remember that these men were so incredibly brave that they are willing to go out into uncharted territory.
Early medieval historian Nicky Scott of Historic Scotland.
They're willing to put their lives into the hand of God, to let him guide them. And they're willing to take these new ideas that they have to areas to spread these ideas, which are then taken up in the local areas that they visit, which perhaps spark new ideas. I think we forget, if people had just stayed in their own little local areas, then I think things would have stagnated. You don't have new developments, you don't have cross-fertilisation of ideas. So it really does so much to enliven not just Christian thought, but all thought.
Well, I think the stories of these guys giving their all are magnificent.
Celtic Church historian Ray Simpson once again.
And, bureaucracy, legalism, self-righteousness, the Pharisee tendency in the church became very strong in the second millennium and in the end of the first millennium, and it is today. Brussels bureaucracy and all that stuff we talk about. Now, to go to the other extreme, you talk about crazy Irish people doing crazy things. They're not crazy, but I think going to the edges is a good way of putting it. Going to the extremity, seeing if we give everything we've got to give, you then discover God in that place which is left. And some of them went to the extremity by going across the sea in little coracles, probably ended in the bottom of the ocean, some of them. But this sense of, St. Brendan had it, that if the wind could blow you where it will and you didn't know where you go, but it would be the same thing as the Spirit of God. 3 of them came across and arrived to King Alfred of England. They didn't know where they were going to be, and they offered himself, and he used them as theological teachers because he was desperate to train the clergy and the people of England when it just become England. And here were 3 Irish theologians allowing the wind to blow them wherever, and they landed there in England, so he used them. So I think this idea of being on the edge is an enormous contribution, almost a corrective to the bureaucratic and fossilised attitude to Christianity.
An historian, Kate Tristram, also had this pertinent comment to make.
Celtic spirituality, the real thing, was extremely strong, powerful, tough, demanding. Of course they were interested in nature because nature was what they lived in. And of course they saw God as the God of creation as well as the God of the Bible and so on. But nothing at all soft or pretty in their understanding of God or nature or their own task, their own job. This is really tough stuff.
There was a quality of ruggedness, I would call it, about the Columban thing, about the Irish thing. The ruggedness and the individualism and the kind of, if you like, that thing that's more suited to the hard grind, you know, where you're throwing on your own resources, whether it's with the elements or with unfriendly people or with your own physical inability maybe to measure up.
Irish church historian and patrician scholar Joseph Duffy.
But the Irish did specialise in that second area where, and that I think is where they are given the marks, say, on the continent. If you go today to the north of Italy or even to the east of France and Belgium and places like that and Germany where that early tradition of the Irish monks is still a living feature of their church life, where the saints are remembered personally and so on. I think that's what they're talking about. That the Irish brought this rugged, and ruggedness is the best word I can think of, which sums it up.
This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. Songs by Cliff Wedgbury. Until we meet again on some other hidden avenue of Irish history, I'm going to leave the last word with early medieval historian David Traynor.
The German philosopher Goethe, he's got a great phrase where he says, whatever you think you can do, or whatever you dream you can do, just do it. Because boldness has its own magic and its power and its genius. And this magic, power and genius is what the Irish monks brought to Europe. They brought commitment. When you commit yourself to something, everything changes. It's like the old proverb, but jump out the plane and look for the parachute when you're on the way down, because you'll definitely find your parachute. And these people, they committed themselves, and this commitment is the kind of thing, the kind of drive that you get in mountaineers who push themselves onto the north face of the Eiger, and they're there and there's no going back, and they've got to keep going, and they've committed themselves and they find the wherewithal to do it. And it's this tremendous commitment, because for them the gospel of Christ was not the gospel that was being preached by these opulent bishops in Gaul at the time who were going out hunting and drinking wine out of goblets and all that. These monks were teaching, take up your cross and follow me. Their commitment was the commitment of Christ himself, and it was a phenomenal drive and boldness that they gave, and Europe's never been the same since.